Hi, and welcome to this, our first of 6 broadcasts about global education and our conversation about education change here in America. I'm Andrew Thomson. I'm with Cisco's Global Education division. We're a division that takes a look at change across the world and to see how we can help our students perform better by making better use of technology in our schools today. This is supposed to be an interactive broadcast, and I want to invite you to offer your comments and your insight as we go along. Just to the bottom right of the picture, you should be seeing a little hand. If you push that, raise your hand, you can get a screen that will allow you to type in a question, which we can then address as it goes along. I'm going to take a few minutes to introduce some of our thinking about changes we're seeing around the world today and how that change is affecting us here in the United States. This is really a remarkable time of change here in the United States. There's a lot of political change, a lot of economic change, and a huge opportunity for us to make a change in our education system. Change is also obviously accompanied somewhat with the challenges today that we're seeing in the economy and the challenges in our communities. But overall, I think there's a tremendous opportunity for us to be able to move forward and really get our education system back on the right track. One of the biggest things that we're seeing impact education systems, not only here in America, but really around the world, is this globalization phenomenon. I know we've talked a lot about globalization, we hear it everywhere, but we're seeing a very real impact in terms of its role in shaping education systems. It changes the demands of our communities. We as individuals, economic and social, are looking for a different relationship with our schools. We see a broader perspective being taken around the world in terms of how competition is working, and we need to be mindful of how it is our education system keeps pace with that. I think there really are two very major things that will affect us as we move forward in this phase of globalization. That's the impact on education, how we use that system to respond to the change in globalization, including the current economic downturn, and the ability for us finally to be able to deploy the internet and the modern technology tools as a means of helping to mitigate some of those impacts of change. Globalization as affects education really has two major impacts. One is external facing, in terms of how we get our economy, our communities, our society prepared to interact with others. The second is how it affects us here at home. One of the things that we know from globalization is that capital is a lot more mobile. Even before the economic downturn in October, we were still seeing a tremendous shift in terms of jobs over the last couple of years, moving toward lower skilled jobs, moving towards lower wage economies that were starting to pick up because they were investing in their education systems. Conversely, we were seeing more opportunities for growth here in terms of the high-tech, high-wage jobs that were able to be created out of the research and development area. So on the globalization front, there's a lot of shift that's happening within the education system, a lot more demands being placed on it. As you see, one of the things that it also impacts is how we as individuals want the education system to work for us. There's more demand as a result of the changes in the economy for access to new programs, more demands from employers to see a more productive workforce come out of the education system, and a whole new set of demands being placed around a new set of skills that will help our economy move forward. So globalization is affecting the education system in really a push and pull approach. New demands for increased services, and also then demands for increased outputs. If we were to take a look at how our education system is performing today, not just within the American context, but really against our competitors and countries that we work with around the world, what we see is that in the 4 key areas that we measure, reading, science, math, and problem solving, it's a bit of a mixed bag. The reading scores are generally in the middle. There's good literacy rates in the country. We are seeing a fairly positive ability for us to be able to impact overall reading scores, and that's a good thing. Unfortunately, as we start to move into the more higher level skills around science understanding, the U.S. is slipping. It's in the bottom third in the 2003 scores. It has slipped again in the 2006 scores. Mathematics, unfortunately, very much the same situation. It's in the bottom third. It has dropped again between the 2003-2006 scores. And perhaps what's most worrying are those 21st century skills we think about is the changes that are coming in the economy that are going to demand workers to reskill many times during the lifetime are really focused around issues of complex problem solving and applying and adapting the information they're gaining. The American school system is not doing a particularly good job of helping on problem solving. In fact, the U.S. ranks in the bottom 5 of industrialized nations in terms of how we are embodying problem solving skills with students. I want to show you a chart that really shows how the U.S. stacks up against other nations, both current industrialized nations that in this chart are represented in black, and emerging nations, which are represented in blue. This chart takes a look at science scores for 15-year-olds in grade 8 that track in terms of not only how they understand it and acquire science knowledge, how much science knowledge they have, but then we also take a look at it on the basis of socioeconomic background. So a narrow student performance, one that's a high performance with a high degree of knowledge and is relatively uniform across all socioeconomic status, will put a country in the upper right. Countries that have lower scores will track, and a larger socioeconomic difference will track in the bottom left. Unfortunately, the U.S., which has a relatively average performance in terms of its science scores, is performing as a moderately lagging nation right now because of the large differential in terms of performance of various students. And we see this for people in the education system, especially practitioners. We know this is a very real phenomenon. Asian and white students are able to perform better. The school system is working better for them. And unfortunately, we're seeing the Hispanic and African American students not performing as well. This is not necessarily an issue that tracks on race alone. It is very much one that we believe tracks more on socioeconomic status and is something that needs to be addressed. This chart, though, what is particularly interesting are if you take a look at the scatter of these light blue countries, you see countries like Estonia, Latvia, Russia, the Slovak Republic, all starting to move up. In fact, Russia today, which used to have a fairly inferior system to the U.S., is now performing at almost the same level, and in fact has a much more narrow gap between students and socioeconomic status. This is, I think, a tremendous case for us to look at change. We need to think about how we move our nations forward, how we continue to see progress in results, and how we narrow that gap so that all our students get the same kind of economic opportunity. Here in the U.S., in Canada, and Mexico, Canada is continuing to remain a top 5 nation in its outcomes, although it's slipping a bit in its math and science scores. The United States is stagnating and sliding back a bit. Mexico is poised to make huge jumps forward. And we really need to think about how it is that we make that investment here in the U.S. to help those students here in America jump forward. There is a big difference between countries, and I know that a lot of political leaders will argue that we simply need to spend more money on the education system. The U.S. already spends more per pupil than any other system in the world. It also has more face time between teachers and students than any other system in the world. But despite spending more money and having more contact time in the classrooms, we're still seeing a lagging in terms of results. Now, part of that is an internal challenge. I mean, that last graph we showed was an average in terms of where the American system was performing. If we take a look within the U.S. itself, we see a tremendous difference. On the right-hand side, you'll see a chart that tracks math scores based on the NAEP scores. And what we see are states like Massachusetts and Minnesota performing significantly above the national average, whereas we see states like Alabama and the District of Columbia performing significantly below. There's a lot of variance within the states in terms of how our performance is. We see, in particular, as we take a look even within a state, big differences. We were just in Texas a couple of days ago meeting with superintendents there, and they were certainly aware of the situation that between 2000 and 2007 on NAEP scores, we were seeing a decline in terms of science, although they were actually improving in their math scores. So we understand that this isn't a science. There is a lot that needs to be done. There are a lot of different factors that come into play at local level, state level, and national level. I want to take a bit of a chance to talk about what some of those factors are that we see impacting superintendents over the next 2 years in particular, and where we think there's a real opportunity for change to get the U.S. education system aggressively moving forward. As we all have heard, certainly it was highlighted again as the new president was being sworn in, there's a real move to take a look at how do we help get our kids and our schools ready for that 21st century economy. There's been a lot of talk about what a 21st century economy is, but I think we recognize that having come out of a phase of school reform over the last 15 years, that really there's more that needs to be done around curriculum, pedagogical approach, the work that we're doing on teacher professional development that will help move beyond the simple testing of basic knowledge, where the focus has been over the last decade. The President has outlined a new program for that, and indeed we think that there are two big issues really affecting the U.S. education system today. One is that political objective that is not just reflected by the administration and state administrations around the country, but in fact is really resident in terms of what voters are demanding. They want a new approach to dealing with the economy and with our communities. At the same time, we're seeing obviously pressures that are coming from tighter budgets as a result of the downturn in the housing market. It's putting a lot of pressure on property taxes, decline in sales taxes, and other mechanisms that are being used to finance the school systems. It's interesting, when we look at how we view our schools, and there's really two different stories that we can see emerging. Last year there was a very significant poll undertaken by Harvard that took a look at how Americans felt the school system was performing. And people are pretty much evenly divided. Slightly more than half think it's headed in the right direction, and just under half think it's headed in the wrong direction. Perhaps not surprisingly, we feel more comfortable with how schools at our local level are performing. We feel more comfortable in terms of their being able to perform and imbibe the skills that we expect our students and our children to be able to have as they move forward. We are less confident about how our neighbors across the states are doing in terms of that overall system. But the one factor that I thought was perhaps most interesting was the question that they had asked across the country was, do you believe that the schools, the police, or the post office are doing a better job in providing public service? The schools ranked lower than the police, and they ranked significantly lower than the post office, which is a surprising thing if you think about the important role that we look at schools in terms of our communities and the important tasks that we give them in terms of educating our children. It's even more surprising that you take a look and you see that Hispanic and African American parents rate the schools significantly lower than either of those other two public services. That said, there is a lot of hope that we can change the way our schools are working, the kind of outputs that they're providing, and the way that they interact with students. And you see this in particular in terms of the application of new technology. This isn't just about one-to-one computing. It's not about making sure every child has a laptop in grade 7. This is about something much more significant in terms of how they are able to access information and how they can reach out and understand the world around them. And what we're seeing is that Americans really believe that technology can help us change and improve the outcomes in education. This is particularly true when we look at getting our kids access to more advanced programs, and very much true in terms of making sure that rural students in more remote areas, get better access to quality teachers, quality programs, and information. So there's a lot of hope that we could use the technology that's available today to help bring our education system forward. For those who are superintendents and are joining us today, I'm going to tell you something you already know, which is this all puts a tremendous pressure on the school system itself to try and manage a variety of sets of changes. You've got a whole different set of learners that are coming into the system. They're expecting a different type of technology. They're tuned in. They're using this social networking technology in terms of their homes, in terms of how they communicate with each other. And yet when they come to school, they enter a dark period where we go back very much to a traditional education system of textbooks and teacher lecturing approaches, as opposed to a more collaborative, interactive approach to learning that they've come to expect outside of the school system. Learners also have, as we've talked about earlier, a lot of different demands in terms of the type of education, the kind of skills that it's supposed to provide them with to help them get jobs in their community, to help them deal with the social needs that they see emerging within their community. On the other hand, as we talk to employers, they too are putting pressure on us. They're looking for a whole different set of skills in terms of what is going to help them be able to grow business, get our economy back on track, and to be able to change the way that as workers come into the system, that they're able to meet the changing demands of the economy. This really comes into two different ways. First, there's a real focus again on core skills. Employers are looking for students to have basic knowledge, a solid, broad range of understanding of basic knowledge, and secondly, to have a new set of what we call 21st century skills. If you think about what those skills are, on the one hand, the basics are kind of the skills that will get you hired, that ability to undertake tasks, to be able to perform. The 21st century skills are the ones that if you don't have them, get you fired. Those are the basic ones around collaboration, being able to work in teams, being able to have the ability to work independently, that ability to problem solve, and to be able to adapt to a quickly changing workplace. Those are really the two big pressures that we see impacting the education system. And so we've got a lot of work to do as superintendents, as practitioners in the system, to think about how do we manage those two different demands. Demand from learners for a different approach to learning, demand from employers for a different set of outputs. When we take a more in-depth look at what employers are talking to us about, and we ask them how it is that they see the school system providing students with the skills that are going to help the economy grow, help them succeed as workers in a new globalized economy, it's interesting in terms of what they identify as really the core 21st century skills. The report Tough Choices for Tough Times in 2007 really took a very in-depth look at this. And right at the bottom of this chart, one of the things you'll see is that employers most highly ranked as a new 21st century skill, critical thinking and problem solving. Almost 80% identified that as a core new skill that's going to be important for graduates to have over the next 5 years. I highlight that because if you think back a minute or two ago when we were looking at the performance as we were taking stock of the system, this is the area where the system actually performs most poorly compared to other countries. It is outperformed by most of the other industrialized countries, including some of the new emerging European ones. So we need to do a lot to think about how it is that our teaching and learning in our classrooms helps provide students with this new set of critical thinking and problem-solving skills, as opposed to the basic reading, writing, and arithmetic that the focus has been on over the last decade. Now, I know a lot of people are going to be saying, who are thinking about this, that's all fine and good, but we aren't currently testing for that. And where schools get their funding and the accountability mechanism is all based on how you respond to the standardized tests. Cisco, Intel, and Microsoft have just launched a partnership to help us to be able to measure these set of 21st century schools, and we're working closely with the OECD to develop a new form of 21st century assessment that will help us measure this, in hopes that we can start to quantify it and that we can identify very clearly how we measure up and how the system is able to advance these skills internally. So we understand that right now we've got employers demanding on the one side a new set of skills to be developed. On the other hand, we've got an accountability regime which is not really focused on that and is much more traditionally focused on the reading, writing, and arithmetic skills. This is one of the big pressures that's going to have to be addressed by the new administration as it moves forward. Another big challenge we all have, obviously, are at a very local level, a very practical level, how it is we handle the changing financial times. Apart from the broad economic difficulties that the country is facing today, we also know that the mortgage crisis has caused a drop in property values, which is impacting our property taxes. We're seeing right now that almost all states, there's only, I think, 7 states that are not expected to be running some kind of a budget deficit within the next 2 years. And indeed, there was an article in the USA Today 2 days ago which was indicating that by 2010 they expect that gap between demand for services and the ability to pay for them to widen at a state level to almost $300 billion. Given that spending on schools at a state level is right up there with the healthcare spending, the states really don't have many options to deal with this. Apart from new federal transfers in and economic recovery, we're seeing the schools facing budget cuts. And indeed, this year alone, we've seen 16 states already cut their K-12 budgets. Another 21 have cut their post-secondary budgets. And we're expecting to see even further cuts next year. So this is obviously a real challenge for us at a practical level. That said, there is good news. And that comes in the form of the stimulus bill, which is currently before Congress. In fact, last night, the House has approved a stimulus bill, which would make an unprecedented investment in education. We see a $6 billion investment in our post-secondary education system, for upgrades to make sure that higher ed system is able to provide the kind of laboratory space and a physical environment that is going to help the economy grow through improved research and development. There's $6 billion that's contained in the bill to improve rural connectivity, which is really critical if you think about the slide that was showing our expectation that rural students will be able to get the same quality of education as urban students. That ability to upgrade those broadband connections is going to be sizable. And then, perhaps most importantly, we see a $14 billion investment, which will be coming forward directly down to school divisions for capital expenditures. A couple of days ago, we were meeting with just over 100 superintendents and administrators in Texas to talk to them about what their priorities were. And it was very interesting to hear that in almost every case, as we were talking about how that $14 billion is going to get distributed, the priority that they were placing on information technology, upgrading it in classrooms, upgrading connections, upgrading the overall wiring and infrastructure of the schools to accommodate that, was high on their list of things to do. And if you think about this money, which can cover everything from roof repairs through to new technology purchases, I think it was really encouraging to hear that superintendents were saying they want to use this money to be able to invest in that next generation of education. This is a tremendous opportunity that the U.S. has. It is as far as I know, the only country that's structuring its recovery bills, its infrastructure, its stimulus bills in a way that specifically is targeting education. I think that's being done for a reason. There is a clear connection between the ability for us to invest in that infrastructure and make sure our schools have that modern learning environment with the policy agenda that's being brought forward by the administration, and indeed is reflected in many ways across party lines, and we're using somewhat different approaches in the states. Both Republicans and Democrats have really focused on education reform. There are some really innovative approaches being taken in a number of states. And what we're seeing coming down now is, I think, an opportunity from the new federal administration to focus on 5 key areas in terms of how that stimulus and their agenda on education will come together to help improve overall outcomes for American students. The new administration is saying they're going to put a focus on that early childhood education, 0 to 5 education. We know investments there are significant. They really do bear tremendous results if we can make sure that children enter the school system with the core abilities around reading and communications, that they have an interest in learning, that will help propel them through the system as we move forward. There is going to be, I think, a fairly significant change coming around the No Child Left Behind legislation as it looks to be reauthorized, and we'll look to see, obviously, how they incorporate in the current testing and accountability regime with some of the new 21st century skills that are going to need to be brought in. There's obviously a huge focus on how we deal with narrowing the achievement gap that we're seeing between students in various states and indeed between the socioeconomic classes. So improved completion rates, better outcomes there is going to be a tremendous impact, or a tremendous focus. The other area that there's a lot of attention on and is, I think, going to be probably one of the biggest ways that we can move forward change in the system is to start looking at how it is we deal with our teachers' professional development itself, what the teaching force really looks like. The U.S. has been a real leader in terms of innovating with a new approach to teaching. And what we see is really an increased kind of stratification within the teaching system. Teach for America is a tremendous program that's brought a whole number of enthusiasts in. We're seeing a new generation of teachers emerging out of teaching colleges who are coming in with better pedagogical skills. We're seeing more expert teachers employed by the system to be able to help with making sure that the leadership is there. And then we're also now seeing a real focus on bringing in more specialists in maths, in sciences, in those STEM skills to be able to help the students be able to get advanced knowledge. Finally, the other area where we are expecting a lot of change, and the infrastructure spend should help with this, is to help teachers teach with new tools. Chalkboards, textbooks are all fine, but that's not really the way we're going to help propel our system forward. And the stimulus package that the House has approved last night, we'll see what the Senate does with it as it moves forward, provides us, I think, with a real opportunity to make that investment in 21st century education, which should help move forward American competitiveness. All of this, I say, really is a prelude to the work that is going to happen at a local level. We can talk lofty thoughts about what's happening around the world. We can talk about what Congress is doing to stimulate change. We can talk about what state legislatures are passing in terms of new accountability measures. It still all really comes down to what happens in the classroom, what happens between students and teachers, what happens between teachers in the collegium as they deal with principals and other school leaders. And that's a big focus that we need to have a very frank conversation about in terms of how we build a more collaborative environment, how we make sure that we are sharing best practices, and at a school district level, how it is that we can make sure that what works is replicated and spread across the system. This remains the greatest hope that we have in the system today. And no doubt it is going to require another round of education reform as we move forward. And I know we're all fatigued from that, having just gone through 8 years, No Child Left Behind. But we have an opportunity now with the new spending that's coming in, with the understanding of how the technology relates, to be able to really help the school system start over and get ready for that 21st century. We think in broad brushstrokes that it really comes down all of these pressures from parents, from policy leaders and politicians, from employers, and indeed from students really come down to kind of four major areas that we see great opportunity for advancement here in the U.S. One is on the issue of system leadership. There, I think, is a real recognition that the people who are at the top level of the system, superintendents, principals, it's the head of schools, and the work with departments needs to change in terms of how we make sure we're sharing the pedagogical best practices, how it is that we are sharing a modern curriculum on everything from lesson plans on through the very core curriculum and competence-based issues that need to be addressed as we move forward. That's all happening at a local level. What we now need to do is start to knit it outside of our districts so that we reach out and are able to build a broader education community beyond the walls of our current school. System leadership is going to be essential for making sure that happens. Second big change that we see coming is as a result of the modern information technology systems we're employing, we're getting a lot better data. Teachers are able to now get real-time data by using smart boards, Promethean boards, these smart whiteboards in classrooms. We're able to track broader trends in education through our formative and summative assessment programs. And all of this allows us to really start to move towards data-driven decision-making. We are going to be in a much better position to personalize, not necessarily individualize, but personalize that learning. New technology will allow us to use video, to use competency-based courses online, to be able to really draw students back into learning. And I think that's going to make a tremendous difference in terms of how, as class sizes are growing, how we can actually help propel forward the overall ability for students to learn. A third area that is very significant is to make sure through all of this that we've got a seamless infrastructure. The fact that we ask kids to power down when they come into schools inhibits that learning and in fact makes it less relevant to their lives today. It may sound like a peculiar thing, but one of the big skills that we see teachers demanding is that ability to think about how it is they can connect their classrooms to the informal learning that's going on outside of the schools today. And there are some very simple things that can be done in terms of making sure that we've got wireless networks in place that allow that to happen seamlessly, that within the schools we're talking about how we use that new technology to connect with students, how it is we make sure teachers have those skills so the system is simplified, always on, ubiquitous, and ever ready. A fourth area that we see is really, I think, going to start to impact more is the challenge of how we square the budget issues with demands for new services. And this is certainly one of the things that superintendents and state superintendents, commissioners of education, are going to need to tackle in the next couple of years. And this is a question about how we get a more efficient education system. As I said earlier, it's a rather unusual situation that the U.S. spends more per pupil than any other system in the world. And in terms of its rankings among industrial nations, it really is in the bottom 5. This is a real worrisome thing. If we can get bigger bang for our buck out of our education spend, if we can make sure more of that money actually helps improve outcomes, we're going to be in a tremendous position to be able to gain. So that emphasis on making the back office applications, bringing down the overall administrative costs of the system through better use of technology, I think is a very significant opportunity for us in the school system today to make sure that the current spend is invested where it's going to make the biggest outcomes. At the school level itself, there are really 4 tasks that we think superintendents and school leaders, principals, and classroom experts are going to need to look at very quickly, and the technology is going to allow a lot of change in this. The curriculum redesign is a very significant part of that, and really it goes hand in hand with assessment. Curriculum and assessment up to now have been somewhat disconnected, and I appreciate the objective that Secretary Spellings had in bringing in No Child Left Behind as a means of measuring across the country how schools were performing. The problem is it was largely disconnected from the curriculum that was being employed within the schools. We have an opportunity, I think, now to really take a look at how we bring these two things back together, especially as we start to measure a new set of skills, those 21st century skills that are being advanced. And groups like the Partnership for 21st Century Skills that has been active in the U.S. now for, I think it's about 8 years, has really helped to define what those skills are. From there, we should be able to work back in curriculum in terms of what it is that needs to be taught in schools, how we incorporate that into our design, and then, as I've said, the work that's being done through the Cisco Intel Microsoft partnership with the OECD and others to start to assess that should help to close this loop. This is an active conversation. It's something that educational leaders are going to have to dedicate some time to thinking about, sharing their views on, so that we actually get it right this time. Professional development is another tremendous area of opportunity to use the technology. That ability to develop a professional learning community that focuses on that is a teacher-focused learning system, but is student-centered, is going to be tremendous. That ability for us to make sure teachers are sharing the knowledge that they have with their peers, that we are investing enough time and support into their ability to keep modern in their pedagogical approach, and the ability for us to make sure teachers are comfortable in terms of using the technology, are comfortable with what the curriculum design is, and understand how it connects to the assessment regime is going to be critical in terms of making sure that next set of reforms work. Superintendents are the linchpin in terms of making sure these 3 things come together. The ability to tie curriculum, assessment, and professional development, if we get it right, will make tremendous change in our education system and in our outcomes. Finally, we need to have, I think, a lot more open and honest dialogue about accountability. As we've seen in earlier slides, accountability at a community level is not just about how the money is spent. It is about how the system is working. And we are going to need, I think, as we look at measuring 21st century skills, as we move the system forward, think again about how it is we connect our schools as hubs of the community back to the community. We need to look at ways of explaining how that return on investment benefits our overall economy, benefits students as members of a community and a society, and benefits students as potential employees as they graduate out. We need to take a much more holistic approach to thinking about accountability. Which really brings us, I think, to the final slide that I want to emphasize today, and that is about a holistic system transformation. Over the last decade, we've really chewed on different portions of this without really tackling it all in sequence. And I do think that there is a sequence that we need to work our way through. It is about the pedagogical and classroom practices that need to change. It is about making sure that we are infusing into that the new 21st century skills, not simply working on catching up in reading, writing, and arithmetic. We need to look at reforms that draw on the technology we have today to allow us to collaborate, that allow us to share, that allow us to be able to push forward a more rigorous professional development routine for teachers, and indeed, beyond more rigorous, I think more robust, so that teachers can reach out on a more regular basis to upgrade skills, get information, and be able to inform their practice. And finally, obviously, it's not just Cisco's view, but I think increasingly, as you see from the polling, Americans' views, that we need to be able to make better use of our technology. The idea that the schools that I grew up in and went through are simply not going to cut it today in terms of what our kids are expecting, or indeed in terms of what we as parents or as part of a community are expecting. We need to make sure that technology is there. We need to look at how we use it to draw in new forms of learning. There's a tremendous push forward to use more video in schools, and we need to make sure that the infrastructure is there to take advantage of that. Things like podcasting, the social networking, the ability to draw online information, all needs to get incorporated into our school system, and we need to really rethink how it is digital learning evolves far beyond the debate that we went through in the early 80s and 90s about one-to-one computing. We're at a point now where the technology allows us to do so much more than that, and we need to make sure that we're able to capture it and employ it to drive the better student outcomes. So finally, it really comes down, I think, to two things. One is the people and practices. The system is run by people. It's not a formula-based system. There's interaction. It's a social construct in terms of education. We need to respond to social phenomena, and we need to make sure that the role of teachers in classrooms is strengthened and the tools that they have is improved. Secondly, we need to make sure that the learning environment is able to keep pace with what it is that students want to be able to access today. We're simply not making use of the tools that we have available. And we need to take advantage of the opportunity through the stimulus funding and other resource reallocation to make sure that that learning environment is in place and is able to help us move forward. I want to invite you to participate in a broader debate about education reform. The problem with doing these kind of seminars is that I think there's a tendency to say, oh, well, I agree or disagree with whatever the so-called expert thinks in terms of education. There are so many different experiments and pilot projects and so much wealth of expertise available in the U.S. today in our school districts and in our communities that we need to start sharing that. And we've, as a result, set up a collaboration website that will allow us to profile thought leaders, but also to be able to share our own experience. And I really want to encourage you to join that dialogue for action, to sign on to GETideas.org, which is there for you to be able to get a bit more thinking, share your thinking about what is working in schools, where you think we've got difficulties, to be able to take a look at case studies that have been done around the globe, to be able to share some of the resources and ideas that are out there. And we're making sure that we've got some high-quality thought leaders on the website who are blogging for us and sharing their ideas about what they see the opportunities being. So there is a real opportunity for us to get a conversation started, and I want to encourage you to do that by joining us in that dialogue on GETideas.org. That is the end of my formal presentation. Fortunately, we've still got about 20 minutes to be able to have a dialogue and to be able to ask and answer some of the questions. I'm told that what I need to be able to do is read you the questions as they go forward, and so I'll do that, and then we can hopefully we've stimulated a bit of thought and some debate, and that we'll be able to pick it up from there. One of the questions that came in is regarding the countries that are leapfrogging ahead. What are they doing to make this happen? It's interesting as we take a look at the emerging markets, and there's really two major things that I see happening in terms of why they're leapfrogging ahead. First of all, they are not dealing with the kind of legacy systems that we have. They are basically going in, and as we look at especially emerging Europe, making significant new investments as they've come out of that Soviet era. They've been able to modernize their system and really start afresh. We are still in many ways adapting and adding on to our existing systems. We're constantly amending them, but we've not had that luxury of simply being able to go in and reinvent it. One of the big things that they have been doing is making tremendous new investments in infrastructure, in modern technological investments in the schools. They've invested a lot more in terms of redesigning curriculum at a national level. There is a lot of focus on how it is that teachers are trained up then to to teach these systems. One of the cautions I would say about the countries that are leapfrogging forward, though, is that and not to minimize the challenges that they face, because they are significant. The challenges that we face in the large multicultural democracies really are fairly substantial in terms of the breadth and different types of students that we're dealing with. And you can visit just about any classroom in America today and be amazed at exactly how significantly varied the student population is. We really are going to need to think about how it is we can draw on that breadth of experience we've had in teaching kids, invest in the technology, invest in curriculum reform, and be able to do that in a way that assists a very varied student population to be able to move forward. This is a big challenge for us, and it's a challenge that even leading countries like Canada, middling countries like the UK are also facing, because there are different socioeconomic issues that we need to deal with, and are going to need to be careful in terms of how we move forward in a way that's still responsive to what communities want. But certainly what we're taking a look at are many of the same issues that we're facing here. They've simply gotten a jump forward. Obviously, they've got a lot further to go in terms of the work to move forward. But we need to get off of this approach where we're simply stagnating. And those are some fairly significant changes that we see happening around the world. One of the questions that has been asked is, are any school systems already trying to implement the holistic transformation that you're speaking of? Yes. There are some really interesting approaches to making education change happen here in America. And two very different approaches, if I can use as an example. The reforms that are being undertaken right now in Massachusetts that are being driven forward are really driven around how an investment in the current system through improved teacher professional development, new investments in technology, changes to the way classroom structure and curriculum are moving forward, how all of that's tied together at a leadership level to be able to change the system. That is a very ambitious education reform approach that's being taken here in the U.S. today, and is being done at a state level to a greater or lesser extent cooperation with districts. If we take a look at what's happening in Louisiana, which is another state that is really trying to move forward in terms of its education reform, we see a slightly different model, more of a parental choice model being introduced, where they are looking more at using charter schools and vouchers to enable, incentivize change in the system. One of the school systems that we worked a lot with after Hurricane Katrina came ashore is Jefferson Parish. Jefferson Parish system, under the leadership of Dr. Diane Rousseau, has done a remarkable job of turning around an education system that was moderately well-performing, but really is now very high-performing in terms of its approach. Under the superintendent's leadership there, we saw a big investment in professional development, a big reinvestment in terms of the infrastructure of the schools, a real cooperative working relationship with the teachers to make sure they were familiar with the new objectives and the goals and the technology. And as a result, we've seen a big jump forward in terms of Jefferson Parish's in overall test scores. If we look at states like Oregon, and they want to undertake a major education reform called Accelerate Oregon, that's looking at how the technology can be better used to deal with rural and urban divide and to reach across socioeconomic barriers to help the education system perform better. There are a lot of different systems across the U.S. today that are experimenting on this. I think the big challenge for us is how it is we can get this to happen not just at a very local level or a state level, but to indeed make this a national wave of change. And what I see in terms of the experimentation happening across the country, I think is really a positive sign, with the new investments that are coming out of the stimulus bill and the new kind of thought leadership that we're seeing emerging at state and national levels that can really make this happen. One of the questions I've asked is, does Cisco have lobbies in Washington and other countries to help countries understand how technology can help education? Yes, although to be very honest, we accept the fact that we are primarily a technology company. We see the opportunity here as enabling those who are real experts in education, true thought leaders in education, to be able to get the kind of platform and profile that they need to be able to influence change. And as we work around the world in developed and developing countries there's a real opportunity for us, I think, to build a broader ecosystem, a real partnership network of people of like-minded thought to be able to influence that change. Certainly we spend a lot of time with legislators, we spend a lot of time with educators, talking about the practical steps that can make the education system different. But that message is much more powerful when people who are actually making it happen are able to share their ideas. That's one of the reasons that the GETideas.org site is so important in terms of this dialogue. It allows us to share that information, to be able to identify who's leading, and to figure out how it is we can help profile them in terms of getting their voice through a broader megaphone to the political leaders in Washington, at the States, and indeed around the world. One of the pieces I'm probably most encouraged with, having spent many years in the legislature working on education initiatives. One of the things I'm very encouraged to see over the last couple of years is that business is taking more of an active role in terms of supporting education as opposed to simply trying to direct change. And I think that there's a real cooperative environment coming forward now between educational leaders, employers in business, and the political leadership of the country that's going to help us make this change happen. Finally, the last question, and then we'll wrap up. Given the economic situation, what practical steps do you think can, in fact, be undertaken in the short term? Or will we be waiting for 2 years or more for an improvement in the economic situation before embarking on meaningful steps? That is the $64,000 question. How is it we take advantage of the opportunity for change today to get that change moving? The fact that there is, I think, a real substantive desire on the part of the American public for change will help propel this forward. Certainly the financial situation, the economic upheaval we're seeing right now is impacting the pace of that change. But I don't think it changes that fundamental ability to start making it happen. The investments that we'll see what Congress finally approves and what the President signs off on for a stimulus package, but the fact that education focuses so prominently on that, both in terms of new infrastructure investments, but also in terms of federal transfers to states to support that education, I think allows us to continue the progress moving forward. The big challenge that I think we face as an education system is how do we get past the fragmentation of every school within small districts, moving across 50 states. How do we start to knit all of this change back into a meaningful framework that really impacts the overall American education system? The system's fragmented today. There's lots of innovation. We've come through a remarkable period of innovation over the last decade. We've had a lot of pilot projects that have been undertaken. The big issue today is how it is we get the thought leaders, the people who have been experts in making this happen, how we get them the platform and the forum to start to develop a true American education system. And as we talk with people at the National Governors Association, Council of State Legislatures, the work that's being done by the Council of Chief State School Officers, work that's being done at local levels and at states and indeed across broad networks of education, we really do see people coalescing around a central set of ideas. We're past the point of debate about simply accounting for our actions and accounting for the money. People now want to make sure the money's being spent on real change. I don't think it waits. It doesn't mean we need to wait for the economy to turn around. In fact, I would think it would be a huge mistake if we wait. Now is the time that we've got an opportunity to really drive real change. Let's take advantage of the technology. Let's take advantage of the stimulus bill. Let's take advantage of that goodwill that's out there right now to connect our education system back more closely with the needs of our communities and our economy. And I hear that from legislators, I hear that from educators, and I hear that simply from parents and students. This is a time that we can make a difference. I want to encourage you again to share your expertise, share your ideas about how to do that. Join us in the online dialogue and join us in helping to move things forward. With that, I want to thank you very much for tuning in today. Like I said, this is the first of a series of webinars and broadcasts about our global education vision. I want to encourage you to look for the future broadcasts. We have 5 more to go. And thank you once again for taking the time today to join us. Thank you.